Thanks everyone for joining. I know it's almost time for the holidays for everyone. It's probably the last working day for a lot of people, or maybe beyond the first working day. And I apologize for doing this so close to the holiday season, but we wanted to have a walkthrough and an explanation for people that had expressed interest in some of the work that's been done on the idea of an agreement within the WTO on the supply of public goods. And so the format's going to be, I'm going to walk through an initial presentation explaining the thinking behind this proposal. And then Luis Villeron from Innovarte in Chile is going to be like an initial respondent, and he's going to present some slides and commentary on the proposal, and then we'll open it up for a discussion among the participants. Claire Cassidy is doing all the technical work on this presentation. If you have any issues or anyone has any issues getting connected, or speaking or raising their hand, they should just let her know. So I think I'll go right into the slides if that's okay with everybody. And Claire, could you share the first slide? So this is the title slide. So yeah, and if you could just don't switch slides until I ask you to, it'd be cool. But you can switch now to the second slide. So for people that are not really familiar with this, for some time we've been involved in issues that I would sort of broadly describe as public goods issues or public interest issues. So we work a lot on issues at KEI on things like we've worked on expanding access to copyrighted works for blind people. We've done quite a bit of work on trying to expand access to drugs. We've also been interested in areas that we're not really directly involved in, but I think we all are aware of that there's issues of whether or not the world can deal with a lot of issues. It's just problems with refugees or famine or natural disasters or just a variety of other areas where you would normally think if a government was acting, it would be something that would be kind of natural for a government to respond to. But when it's a global problem or it's a cross-border problem, it's more challenging. So the first point we wanted to make is that it's our understanding that there's a chronic undersupply of goods that have public and social benefits. And this is a persistent problem for all levels of society, not just globally, but this is even down to the local government level. I think we've all experienced, the sort of challenge of dealing with people that are homeless or inequality or cleaning up the environment, all sorts of different things. Now, governments have tools to address these issues through taxation and regulatory measures at the local and national level, but the international dimension really suffers from a lack of enforceable mechanisms to ensure that there is collective action and the supply will be credible and sustainable over time. And that's where things break down. It's got, governments have a lot of powers, but once you sort of go beyond the national borders thing, unless you're like the EU or something, I mean, it really kind of falls apart. I mean, it doesn't completely fall apart, but I mean, it's much more challenging. And one of the things that we found is that governments often lack confidence that others will follow through on commitments to do things. I sometimes give this example of if you go out to a restaurant and there's like 12 people at a big meal, and then people start ordering first course, second course, really fancy wine and things like that. And then you sort of notice people start leaving before the meal is over. You don't want to be one of the few people left when the check comes. And I think that's sort of a similar concern that governments have when they talk about starting new projects going to take place over time. They're going to cost a lot of money. They may feel like they don't want to walk away from a commitment partway in, but they're not sure how other parties may feel about that. Next slide. Now, governments can overcome this by entering into treaties, trade agreements, and other kinds of binding agreements. But these things are really time-consuming to negotiate and to ratify. And the new institutions that require, setting up a new institution is really, not only takes time, but you have to staff them, you have to monitor them, you have to use your diplomatic skills. I mean, they're really one of the reasons why people are not doing like tons of international agreements on very public goods things. It's just a lot of work to set them up, to manage them, and they're kind of a pain to kind of keep track of. Another point I think is important is that many useful cross-border collaborations involve small numbers of interested parties, or they're discrete projects that are not large enough to justify a new legal instrument. So you may feel like there's something you want to collaborate on, but it's sort of putting together the agreement may not always seem like a big enough problem that you really want to create an entirely new institution around it. And then enforcement is frequently a challenge. Claire, if you could give me the next slide. Now, as we've embarked on this project, and I'll get to more of this later when we talk about the consultations, but one of the challenges we've had is I'll start out, it's just the term public goods. Now, I think most people on this call have some kind of, it's a well-educated crowd on this call, and I think people here are familiar with that people often define the idea that a public good is often defined as something that's non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. That's sort of a classic thing that you see in articles and textbooks, and people I think are very often proud to sort of know what this technical definition is. And one of the problems is almost nothing fits into this category. Almost everything that governments do is either rival in consumption or excludable. Sometimes people would bring up like information goods as being non-rival in consumption, but the whole point of the TRIPS agreement is to make them excludable, right? You've got patents, you've got copyrights, you've got trade secret protection, and even roads, you can have tolls on them and things like that. So almost everything the governments do is right now is either rival in consumption or excludable. Not everything. I mean, and now the term was really popularized based on three articles that were written by Paul Samuelson from 1954 to 1958. And what Samuelson proposed was what he describes himself as an extreme polar case of a public good. And he tried to find cases when there was absolutely no possibility of the market supplying the good. And it would be, and so this idea that if you have goods that were completely non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, that you'd have to have the government act, because you couldn't really expect, the public sector actors, you couldn't really expect the market to do it. He used examples of a circus on a circus where there was next to a hill where you could watch the circus from the hill and other things like that. So he did come up with a few examples, but his initial paper, it was quickly pointed out by a lot of people in the field that there's a lot of things that governments do that don't fit his narrow definition, and he agreed with that. And in his 1955 paper, he was clear to point out in his subsequent work that he didn't mean to say that that all public expenditures had to fit into this category, but he said that characteristics were important and they might have some component of them. He made reference to public goods, including the redistribution of incomes, paternalistic policies, the supply of goods where competition is not, atomistic competition is not realistic, and a myriad of generalized economic and diseconomy situations where the private interests cannot be expected, can be expected to deviate from social interests. So Samuelson himself was really clear about the fact that this non-rivaling consumption and non-excludable definition was not the general case for public expenditures, public goods. And even in these papers, they use different terms. They use public goods, but they also use terms like public expenditure, public consumption goods, collective consumption goods, or government activities. And so I want to make it clear that when we're talking about this, we're not talking about goods that are only non-rivaling consumption and non-excludable, because that's a really, really tiny subset of things. And the other thing is that it's really an urban legend that Samuelson was defining public goods this way. He was coming up with an extreme polar case, and those were his words. I've written about this in a paper called The Use and Abuse of Public Global Goods in Developing Economics. There's a link to that in the slides. It goes into this issue in more detail. Claire, could you give me the next slide? Now, when you talk about public goods, as I mentioned before, if the public goods are national, you sort of can expect governments to deal with taxation or regulation or other mechanisms within a normal government activity to deal with them. And another thing that people often talk about are global public goods, things that affect everybody on the planet. But there's a lot of public goods that are they're not really global per se. Like if you look at Chagas disease, for example, it's more of a problem. It's more regional in terms of its incidence, in terms of who's directly affected by it. You could say the same thing probably about polio. A lot of some environmental problems like global warming, you could sort of see that as a global problem. But there are other environmental problems which may be cleaning up a river or dealing with some kind of environmental problem, and or it could be really more local. So we think you have a range of things that are both national, cross-border, and occasionally, global public goods. So not all public goods have global characteristics or constituencies. That's another important thing, is that not everybody cares the same about everything. Claire, next slide. These are just some examples that people wanted to sort of make it more concrete, the kind of things that we were really talking about that might be affected by this proposal that we were coming up with. And this could be 1,000 pages long. These are just some types of examples. But the point of this slide was to illustrate that we were thinking beyond, for example, research and development or information goods into other things like famine relief or refugee services. I'm sorry, I don't know why Louise's slide is up here, but yeah, good. Okay, thank you. But it would include things like research and development of new antibiotic drugs and things like that. Next slide. This is a bit repetitive, and I'm going to apologize a little bit for that, but not a lot, because I want some themes that keep coming back here. There are really three things that we've noticed that are particular challenges in creating a supply of what we would describe as public goods that are addressed in the proposal that we're talking about. First, the characteristics of public goods are diverse, as is the willingness of governments to contribute to their supply. And sometimes there's a unique set of donors. In the health area, appeals for treatments like HIV. Well, if you look at the HIV, some governments were really fired up about dealing with the lack of access to HIV drugs. And the U.S. Under President George W. Bush was really interested in setting up the Global Fund and PEPFAR. He really something that really resonated with him. And the French, took the lead in setting up UNITAID, and they were really quite all in this. Not all countries had the same commitment to dealing with the global HIV problem. If you look at antibody drugs, there's a set of countries been very, very active in trying to deal with antimicrobial resistance drugs. It's certainly not everyone, not even everyone in high-income countries. Chagas disease, I mentioned earlier, is more kind of thought of as a Western Hemisphere issue. The point of care, test for TB, et cetera. So for a large set of goods, you'll have they could be really important globally. They could be really important regionally, but who cares enough to actually mobilize and commit money and resources and time and to doing them? Well, it varies. I was struck by someone once telling me that one of the first R&D treaties I looked at had to do with locust and the control of locusts. There's like a whole R&D agreement that I was not aware of in terms of the control of locusts. And then I was told that Japan has a particular interest in leprosy and that they funded a lot of initiatives in leprosy. So I think that's kind of common. From country to country, people have very different interests in what they're willing to support. So trying to put everyone together in one big gigantic agreement, for a lot of things, it's not very efficient. Sometimes you just want to gather the people that care the most about it and create these little coalitions of if the military hasn't corrupted this term, I would refer to coalitions of the willing in sort of a positive way. The second issue is that the cost of supplying public goods often take place over time. If it's something that's going to be done in the short run, you can get people together and everyone can sort of write a check and make a commitment and you're done. But the Global Fund, which was set up 20 years ago, is still going on. And since then, you've had presidents come and go, parliaments, political parties, ruling things have changed. So it's challenging. Is that someone outside honking their horn? I apologize for that. When the cost of doing something is large and when it takes place over time, it's more challenging to get people to commit to something that's going to take multiple years to accomplish, or you're in for the long haul. And particularly when you have presidents and political leadership change. And then I mentioned this before, the last thing, the creation of new treaty, trade, or other agreements are time consuming and they create burdensome governance obligations and they're really difficult. They can be difficult to enforce. Claire, next slide. So and reflecting on these things, at one point, I just want to give an anecdote. I was meeting with the United States Trade Representative in charge of IPR, of intellectual property and investment, named Joe Popovich. And Joseph Popovich was like a legendary longtime negotiator for USTR. When I was meeting with him in like about 20 years ago, and Joe is one of these guys that had been in the federal government for a really long time, and eventually I think he kind of changed his views on some things, and we think in a very positive way. So we become friendly, and I was asking him about the GATS agreement, the service agreement, because I wasn't familiar with it. I knew a lot about the TRIPS agreement. I knew a lot about the intellectual property provisions. But the service agreement, I didn't really know too much about. And at that point, I'd been attending a fair amount of WTO events. And he explained that there's this system where you make offers to liberalize services in different sectors. And they can be very micro. Like you could make an offer to permit the selling of insurance by a foreign company in Montana, for example. I mean, it can be really, really narrow. Or to open up your education sector to foreign entities or even for-profit entities. And so these things were very heterogeneous. They were not all the same. And so what one country would be interested in putting on a schedule would be completely different than what a different country would put on the schedule. And that sort of struck a chord because I thought in the public goods thing, this went to one of the issues that was really kind of problematic, is that not everyone really wants to do the same thing. And the other thing I said is, well, why would anyone put anything on the schedule? Because if you put it on the schedule, it's voluntary to put it on the schedule, but once it's on the schedule, it ain't voluntary anymore. At that point, it's enforceable by WTO sanctions if you don't follow through. And I said, why don't you just do it? If you want to do it, just do it. Why put it on the schedule? Because you might want to change your mind later. And who wants to be sued? And so Joe said, and I always remember this, he said, well, you wouldn't think anyone would do it, but they do. And he says the reason they do is the WTO is this big trading environment. And there's a lot of things going on there. You've got agreements on fisheries, on tariffs, on government procurement, on all sorts of different things. And so what happens at the WTO is what they call offers and asks. So suppose, for example, a country wants something on a tariff, or they want something on the fisheries or something like that. And they may ask for you to give them a vote for something that they want, or to do something that they want on one of these other parts of the agreement. Then you may not want to do it, or you want them to do something in return. So everything becomes kind of a trading shit. Everything has some value because it can be traded for something else. So if there's something you could do, like put something on the services agreement, that's something that you could do as a condition of someone else doing something that you want them to do. So the trading isn't just between services, it's between services and tariffs and fisheries and even stuff that has nothing to do with the WTO. The actual interest in the putting on the WTO services schedule may come completely outside of the WTO and some kind of conversation between countries outside the institution. So I thought about that. I thought, well, that's interesting, because could you apply this to public goods? Could you have a schedule in the WTO where people could voluntarily make binding commitments to supply public goods, and that they would then become enforceable through the WTO agreement? And that was really the genesis of the agreement, was of our work on this agreement, was the idea that we thought the GATS agreement was a potential model for what you could do for public goods. Now, to put more context on it, and I'll talk about this a bit later, but the GATS agreement is considered kind of a privatization agenda by a lot of people. And it's considered kind of a pro-capitalism, pro-market, sort of a trade liberalization instrument within the WTO. And what we were talking about was sort of completely the opposite. It was the sort of public goods supply. And some people began to describe what we were proposing for the WTO as a hack on the WTO. They thought that what we were doing was looking at the WTO architecture, borrowing the institutional presence and funding, and most importantly, I think, enforcement mechanisms, and using them in an area where there's really, I think by all measures, a really big undersupply of public goods. And to put a finer point on it, if you were to go to Davos, when all these sort of CEOs and famous people and important government negotiators, every year sort of show up at the World Economic Forum. And you look at what these billionaires are proposing. Often they're trying to figure out how to sort of increase the supply of public goods. I mean, as people become super wealthy, a lot of them become philanthropists. It's something that I think people recognize as undersupplied globally, is this idea of public goods. And so that was sort of how we kind of got into this. And so, Claire, can you go to the next slide? Now, I mentioned the enforcement. I think the WTO, when I first started talking about it, it seemed like a more persuasive argument, because the WTO was sort of really functioning, I think, differently than it is today. Because now I think the trade people here know that the WTO is really struggling to function right now because of the attacks by the U.S. government on the dispute resolution process and things like that. But getting back to like the fundamentals, compared to other institutions, global institutions, the WTO is considered quite important, because it's an institution people feel like they have to be part of, and they think that the enforcement mechanisms are a critical and core feature of the WTO, which makes it different than, like, say, the Human Rights Council or the WHO. The WHO can pass all sorts of resolutions on setting norms on healthcare, but they're not really considered as enforceable as a norm that appears within the WTO. Granted, that is not quite as that's been sort of weakened in recent years, but I think in the trajectory of time, I think it's an important reason why we look at the WTO, even though it's really hard to do things in the WTO. Next slide, Claire. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, what's really important, I think, in the proposal was we're looking for something where you could have voluntary actions that would become binding, and they would deal with heterogeneous public goods. So the idea is that it could be all sorts of different things. It wasn't like we were trying to organize a treaty on funding antimicrobial resistant drugs or treatments for Chagas disease or to pay for refugee services. It would be something that would be an agreement where all of these different efforts could organize even outside of the WTO, and then walk across the street to the WTO and put their commitments on a schedule and have an instant binding agreement between parties. So it essentially lowers the cost of negotiating agreements because you don't have to create a governance structure, a membership, and a conference of parties, or all that kind of things. You can just walk over and you can talk about it before you get to the WTO, but put it on the schedule. And then people have the ability to at least feel that the other parties in the agreement have some serious commitments that they can rely upon each other. Next slide. I think I've already discussed this. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so this obviously a bit repetitive, but yeah, this is, I just keep coming back to this. You've got the GATS, and we want something similar to the GATS, but for public goods. We want a schedule within the WTO. The countries can put on the schedule things that they want to do to supply public goods. In that sense, it's a fairly simple, and at least in that respect, idea. Next slide. Now, in our work on this, at one point, we developed an actual proposed technical agreement, which I'll provide a link to later, where we went through consultations in Berlin and Geneva with trade negotiators and public goods people, and it was highly technical. And so one idea that I think was important in the discussion of the proposal was this first item, and that is that we wanted the possibility of standardized agreements in addition to sui generis agreements. And by standardized agreement, suppose, for example, you're looking to create kind of a global norm on public goods, and I'll choose the example of open access to government-funded research when it's published. So some agencies around the world and some charities have agreements that they attach to their funding agreements that if they fund research, when you publish a paper in a journal, it has to be available to the public in either 12 months or 6 months or sometimes instantaneously, full text open access, because the funder wants the benefits of the research to be available to everyone. Now, at that point, it becomes a global public good. We thought, suppose, for example, there was a standardized agreement that everyone that made the commitment would agree that within 6 months of first publication, the full text of an article that they was funded by a public sector agency would become available to everyone as open access publishing. Then if you were campaigners, if you were librarians or researchers or scientists that really wanted this in your area, you could campaign to get the governments that you could influence to make commitments, and the commitments wouldn't have to be for the whole government. They could be for particular agencies in the government. Like in the US, you have a different commitment on open access at the NIH than you have, for example, at other funding agencies. But nonetheless, you could imagine the campaigners not having to explain everything they wanted, but to say there's this standardized commitment, there's this norm It's a standardized offer on the schedule, and we want you to join and make a commitment to the offer. And it would simplify the campaigning thing. In other cases, a sui generis thing would be fine. They could be kind of complicated and whatever, but we wanted the possibility, and we wanted a process where if you wanted a standardized commitment, it would be kind of like a norm, that there would be a process of noticing it, inviting people to comment on it, and listening to stakeholders in a process before you actually formalize what the standardized offer would look like. The second thing I want to mention is more of a problem, and that is, suppose, for example, people wanted to have a commitment to do something, and later it turned out they thought that was a bad idea. Not everything that seems like a good idea today will stand the test of time. And so at some point, people may want to be able to exit from an offer. So I mentioned these offers are binding and they're durable, but we thought it'd be important to provide the possibility that they were not 100% forever binding, that there ought to be a way to exit agreement. And so some of the discussion was on things like, if you do exit an agreement you've made on a public good, is there some way you can get out of it that is acceptable? Now, I'll give you maybe not a very good example, but I'll give you an illustration of how something like this might work. In the United States, if you start a nonprofit organization and the nonprofit organization develops a business model and assets, at some point you're allowed in the United States to convert the nonprofit institution to a for-profit entity. But for you to do that, you have to make a considerable payment to public sector or public interest purposes to justify the conversion of what was a nonprofit institution to a former one. So it is possible, but it comes with a cost. And so the question is, if you were to exit a commitment to supply a public good, could there be a way to get out of it that would be efficient? Because sometimes the project you've agreed to turns out to have been a bad idea fundamentally, but you should have to pay a price to exit the agreement. And the last thing I want to mention here in terms of the challenges is the enforcement, because people on a service agreement, if you make a commitment to allow foreign investment in a particular sector of the economy and you don't honor that, a country that wanted to have one of its firms enter that market could be a plaintiff. I mean, they could sue you and say, this is creating a problem for us. But what if it's refugee services or something like that? Like who would if you didn't do what you promised to do, who could actually bring a case, and who would get the benefits of the enforcement action? Because the enforcement actions can be pretty broad within the WTO currently. So those are a couple of areas where throughout the consultations, these things came up as some of the things that people wanted to think about a bit more. Claire, could you make the next slide? What are the benefits of the agreement? Well, again, a little repetitive, but it can replace the need to set up a separate treaty agreement. It can use the existing WTO governance structure and secretariat, or it can also complement separate treaties or agreements by letting the WTO enforcement powers. Suppose, for example, there's a biomedical R&D treatment at the WTO, and suppose it's a protocol that only 20 countries join because they all agree that they want to develop some low-cost testing for monkeypox or something like that. They could include, in our vision, a provision in the WTO agreement that the parties to the WHO agreement, so the World Health Organization agreement, could include a provision that would say that the parties to the WHO agreement would agree to include on a WTO schedule the commitments they've made in the WTO agreement. So in that sense, the WTO enforcement things could be kind of rented out or used by third parties that were developing their own cooperative things, as long as it was sort of considered a qualifying public goods project. So by introducing public goods in the WTO environment of ask and offers, negotiations would no longer be exclusively about the private goods market. And I think that's a good thing. Now, in the United States, if you were to ask people what would be more effective at promoting the development of new drugs, an increase in the NIH budget of $20 billion be more effective than an increase in the amount of money we pay for drugs by $20 billion. Almost everyone, including the drug companies, would say increasing the NIH budget would be more beneficial. The problem you have in the WTO is the only thing you really got is the promotion of private goods. And so right now, to promote innovation, you've got TRIPS, right? And so that's kind of the only thing you've got. You've got really nothing else there. So, there's this sort of pressure, TRIPS plus, enforce TRIPS more and more. But part of the problem, if you look at what governments do, they don't just rely upon IPR system. They also look at government funding, for example, or subsidies or tax credits. And so there's an imbalance right now in the trade system that solely focuses on the private goods, even though in our own lives we value parks, we value anti-poverty programs, we value a lot of things in our own lives and our own communities where we live that are more holistic. I mean, we think the private good market's super important, but we don't think they're the only thing that's important. So this would allow public goods to have some kind of value within the WTO thing just by simply making available a schedule. Next slide, Claire. Getting to the end here. It's a little history. I think we first presented our proposal in 2008 at a workshop at Columbia University that we were, I can't remember this one we were doing with Jeffrey Sachs or not, but we were doing some, this was the good version of Jeffrey Sachs, or at least the better version. Or it may have been a different meeting, but it was an academic meeting. And then we've actually presented this in quite a few places. I only mentioned a few here. We made, I think, our first one at a ministerial meeting was, I think, in 2009. So in a way, a lot of times we used to talk about some of our ideas as new ideas, and now people correct me and they say, Jamie, that's an old idea. So I feel bad because we're basically exposing you to old ideas, but they're not implemented. So in that sense, they're kind of new. And then I want to point out that in 2014, there was an inter-party parliamentary group in the UK that endorsed the idea of working on the WTO agreement on the provision of public goods specifically, because they thought this could be really important in their work on tuberculosis. And then in 2015, the Green Party in Germany, the Henrik Boll Foundation, which is like their think tank, they funded a technical consultation in Berlin. And for this technical conservation, like a full-blown agreement was drafted and submitted to the participants in this two-day meeting and went over the agreement like article by article. And there was a report from the meeting that was prepared by Balasubramanian, who's on this call, and many of you know, titled Trade Agreements and the Supply of Public Goods, Report of the Berlin Meeting to Consider a Possible WTO Agreement on the Supply of Public Goods. And the links are provided, and I think you've all been sent emails with copies of these PDF files. And if you don't have them, they're on our webpage. All the slides from today's event, and so there's a link to this report. And at the very end of Thoreau's report on the 2005 is the actual text that was proposed on agreement. And then the agreement, the report follows. Thoreau basically was keeping notes of the comments that were made by the participants, which were very diverse at the meeting. They were negotiators from high-income countries and developing countries, or people in the public health field. And the South Center was there, and people were kicking the tires, and we really had people that were like real trade nerds that were involved in this conversation, which was really helpful. And we did a follow-up in November the same year in Geneva with a second group of people, and one of the people we tried to bring in were people that really worked on the original development of the original WTO agreements, and some of the WTO's own lawyers. Now, we've continued to have other discussions. Could we have the next slide, Claire? And I'd have to say that we've had a favorable reaction from a diverse set of WTO members. Now, usually when we work on something, we'll have like the Northern European or the Americans will hate what we're doing because it's considered some kind of anti-corporate thing or something like that. But this is not really the way this project has been designed. And I've even had talks with the Chamber of Commerce in the United States and different people in the industry to try and make sure it wasn't really seen that way. And I think, for example, the pharmaceutical industries are big supporters of the PEPFAR program, for example, which is something that they really positive about. So, and some of the higher income countries think of themselves as actually big funders of public good projects, and they complain about, they think some other trading partners can't be trusted. So they kind of like the idea of the enforcement part of the agreement, that this is kind of a grown-up, we're all adults here, let's talk, things cost money, who's going to pay for things, and let's see if we can't get people to actually make serious commitments. And there's no natural opposition to public goods things. Like, there's not like a lot of people campaigning against countries helping refugees or dealing with famine relief or paying for R&D on antimicrobial drugs or anything like that. And like, unlike a lot of things the WTO does, it's not really designed so there's like winners and losers. It's more of a Pareto optimal sort of proposal. That doesn't mean that people wouldn't want to exploit the ability to block things in the WTO if you actually progress that far. I mean, we recognize that. What are the challenges? Well, there's rising attacks on global institutions. You know, people are attacked for being globalist, and this sort of seems to fit that definition. And people are, you know, trying to weaken the WTO enforcement mechanism. And, you know, maybe the liberal trading system's kind of falling apart. I don't know. It's hard to say right now. This could be short-term or transitory, or they could be longer-run things. And the other thing that really didn't come to me at first. At first, I thought, well, this would help people working on climate change and the environment. It would help people working on health. It would help people working on refugees, on food security. All these different groups would all benefit from this. That'd be awesome. We'd have like an awesome coalition to move the thing forward. But it turns out that if everyone benefits, no one feels it's about them. So it's almost impossible. And we had a lot of discussions with environmental groups, for example, like, do you want to engage on this thing? And they sort of look at it like, well, it's, you know, okay, we're part of it, but we're not, it's not only about us. And so in some ways, the fact that it's inclusive diffuses who people, you know, take ownership of it. So that's actually kind of something I didn't expect at first. Next slide. So these are my next steps in no particular order. Describe, and this comes up a lot, describe scenarios where an agreement would be used. So you can make like a real concrete case, like you want to do X, Y, and Z. People get together, they devise something, they put it on, and this is kind of how it plays out. That's one thing that people would like to see, these concrete examples. That's what a lot of negotiators have told us that. And two, I think we'd like to see additional work on these. What we think two challenging copies: the exits from obligations and the enforcement of obligations issues, and how that plays out within the WTO framework. I'd like to see additional work on the modalities for standardized offers. I don't think this is very difficult, but I think it's a good thing to work on. And then we'd like to see a paper tabled in the WTO by a member of the WTO, creating some modalities for moving discussions about public goods forward within the WTO. Next slide. That's all I got for today for this presentation. Thank you very much. And before we get into a general discussion, we wanted to give Luis Villaron from Innovarte in Chile the opportunity to make a presentation as a respondent, and then we want to open up for broader discussions. So, Claire, are you able to start? Luis, are you okay with Claire doing your slides? Do we have Luis?
You're muted, Luis. Still muted. Oh, there we go. Or rather, you're still muted, Luis, but we can see your screen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Thank you. So I will be brief. James has covered, with his eloquency, a very broad topics. So I will try to chip in where I think that needs more enforcement or reinforcement, not enforcement, reinforcement. Well, I think that a first idea is that this agreement is not only simply good of humanity, but also is very important for international trade. Because it will these commitments of providing a public good will require the provision of goods and services that are needed to do so. So, for example, to clean a river or to protect high seas, you need to have a ship, you have to have a crew, you have to have technology. So this will have an impact on trade and market and will create new opportunities. The other important idea, I think, is that this instrument recognize that some countries have a better standing to provide some public goods, either based on where they are located or the technology that they might have or the expertise. So that's allow as was touched by James, a trade, an exchange of public goods from those countries that are best, placed to provide it with other countries that have in other field also, a better standing to do so. For example, like I could think of a case where, for example, Norway with a healthcare research infrastructure that is strong might commit to provide a cure for Chagas, but they are interested in protecting the environment, and they might trade with Bolivia that has a unique geographical position to clean, or to protect some biological diversity in Lake Titicaca. So, being of interest of Norway to this being done in Bolivia, and Bolivia interested in getting the Chagas cure, then they could both come to the table and to make cross commitments of public. And of course, once this is done, then there will foster, collaboration, and also, as I mentioned earlier, there will be also a market, a demand of the technologies that are needed for both goods. So how I was saying, like you will be generating demand for goods and services on specialized products that are needed to address the production of the public good, services, consultancy, and a number of business will be benefit in this process, and also international trade, through the export or import of technologies, as well as the incentive for investment on innovation in the fields that are needed to provide these public services. So and also, being the nature of public good, for example, knowledge of the production of a vaccine, then that that will be the public good, but then the production of the vaccine itself will require that there are companies that are, in the process of making and then distributing and selling. So there are other external, external that will be benefiting from all these advances in the provision of the public goods. But still, I think still we need to have a little bit more work on how we define the public good. It's we see that the strict definition of public good is it's been rejected, and we need to have a more expanded and maybe some criteria that we could use, to identify what will be a public good that qualifies, or a good that has a public interest that qualifies to participate in the agreement. At least for me, it has to be a good that more than one country considers that is important, the provision. There has to be somebody offering, but also has to be other country that agrees that this is something of a broader public interest, and criteria for, and we could think of criteria, general criteria for inclusions, not to have like a really long list as seems the alternative, and within those criteria we might think that those cases less less common, that are goods that are not excludable, or the broad accessibility, like cleaning, the air, or also other criteria could be significant positive externalities, like, for example, disease eradications or education, or addressing critical global challenges, like could be the issue of global warming, undersupply of markets. The best case is like the production of treatments or vaccines, and the support of vulnerable populations, where you can have the examples of humanitarian aid for immigrants or refugees, and other endangered population. So I have a list of public goods that I will skip it, since James has already gone through this, and to focus on what the elements of the current service agreement in WTO could be imported, in this new instrument. I mean, because the question is, will we import everything, or we just some elements are, feasible or desirable to be in? Certainly, as James pointed out, there has to be a schedule of a specific commitment, whether they are standardized or sui generis offers. That's good. Also, we see that's important that to bring the issue of transparency, where countries that make a commitment also will have the commitment to provide and publish the regulations and laws and the legal framework that relates to that, the provision of that public good. To incorporate the possibility of progressive commitments, on the provision of a specific public good, and in addition to the exits that mentioned James Love, also there should be a reference to safeguards that, as a difference of the exit, is not that allowed to getting off the commitment, but at least to make adjustment according to circumstances that are temporary or maybe permanent, so they can deviate from what they specifically committed. The exit and adjustment mechanism, those were covered by James. Also, it's important to keep in mind that we will need to have a review mechanism, also to have an element of technical assistance and capacity building, that will, especially when a developing country is making the commitment, and to consider special and differential treatment, how could play the enforcement and the and the implementation based on the capabilities of a developing country. And finally, there is the question: how do we incorporate the most favored nation treatment principle or the national treatment? And we have to think whether this will apply to the end product, or we will be talking about the provision of the services that are needed to provide the end product. So that's, I think, is a pending question. And because of the time, I will stop here to hear comments from others. I'm happy to answer any question.
Thanks, Luis. Just one thing on the definition of public goods. I put in the chat a link to the 2015 draft, and page 24 is where that agreement proposed a definition of what would be included as a definition of a public good. But I'd like to open the floor up now for people to ask questions and to engage in the conversation, if there are any. I know it's been kind of a long initial set of presentation. And there's none. That can't possibly be true, but yeah. I would say that one of the reasons this thing has sort of been kicking around but hasn't gone too far, it's been competing with other negotiations that are going on, and sometimes the other negotiations move to the front, and then this thing sort of gets put to the side, because it's always been thought that doing something in WTO would be particularly challenging because of the hard consensus rule that's required in the WTO, and also it's a little bit of a long-term thing. And then you've got Trump coming in, and crazy things happen, not just in the United States. So people kind of wonder. But like the pandemic treaty negotiation, for example, or the pandemic itself really derailed things for the last couple of years. Everyone was kind of focused on, not everyone, but a lot of us were focused on that. And then there was the WIPO negotiation of the development agenda, and then we spent 5 years on the WIPO with Luis and other people on the call here with the WIPO negotiation of the treaty for the blind, and there's been like a several kind of like detours in terms of what's going on, but we still think, and others still think, and people come back to this. This is something that we ought to revisit and move forward. And we've decided in the next 2 years, even though we're not, our time horizon is longer term. We don't really mind the idea that this isn't something that's going to be done in like the next 24 months. I mean, it's a conversation that has to go forward. But I'd like to know if there are any reactions from any of the people on the call of what they heard so far. I'm seeing. Josh has unmuted himself, so I assume he's going to.
Yeah. So just one question, Jamie, which is like, this is all about public funding and public taxation. So I think at some level, and what do you think is going to get governments to commit to increasing taxation to be able to fund the public goods?
Well, it's not just about taxation. I mean, for example, the open access publishing thing is something that's something that governments are doing right now, and maybe they want other people to do it too. And licensing of government-funded technology is something that sometimes the concern is why would we do it if other parties won't do the same thing or something? But there are projects that countries would invest in if they thought they were not the only investor. And it makes it in a way, it's designed to make spending government money on some cross-border issue more attractive to a party if they think they have partners in the thing they can count on. So the amount of money they spent would be proportional to what they think is appropriate for the project. So one of the problems right now is there may be some cross-border problem, and so you ask the government, you want to pay for it, and they go like, well, I don't want to pay for the whole thing. I mean, we're not the only beneficiary. And so how do you, there are a lot of things that people would be willing to, I feel the same way. There's a lot of things I'm happy to contribute to, but I don't want to pay the whole bill for. And so it's just sort of common sense. Like, are there things where cooperation is in everyone's interest if you can kind of figure out a way to make it happen? And does this lower the cost of creating those cooperative agreements? And we think it does, because it eliminates the need to have, in some ways, separate governance structures, separate agreements. Luis, you got your hand up?
No, just to complement it to Josh, that in all these cases, the governments already are investment in one country in something in another. You know, what we are proposing is to sort of like to do it more coordinated and with more incentives to do it in a bigger scale. So it's not that they're going to start researching on something or cleaning the water, because that's being done already.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have any, objection to facilitating and, providing enforcement mechanisms that encourage people. But the problem that we know is that governments dramatically underinvest. And, is it better than nothing? Of course. But it doesn't seem to me to address the real heart of the problem, which is unwillingness to tax and unwillingness to actually invest at the levels that we need.
Well, it certainly addresses part of the unwillingness to invest, and that is that whether or not you think you're the only investor, or whether or not you think you can depend upon your collaborators. And that's one of the primary motivations for it. The other thing it really addresses is the cost of creating collaborations. Look, I'm involved in the WTO agreement on the pandemic agreement, like several people on the call are. We've had, like, every month there's like one or two-week negotiating session that takes place in Geneva with like lots of people there. It's really an expensive negotiation. It's been going on for years. And if they set it up, then they're going to have to go through a ratification procedure, which will take more years. And the whole thing has really no enforcement mechanisms built in.
Jamie, as I said, I have I'm fully in support of it. I'm just saying, I watch the climate change negotiations, right? And, it's really at some level about a massive amount of money that needs to be pumped in, and that's what's being resisted, whether it's loss and damage, whether it's financing for tech, whether it's, commitments to change infrastructure in countries. It's just, that's what so I have no problem with the idea. I just wish that you could link it to something that would actually commit to really massive investment.
Well, so suppose, for example, and I'll call him Nicholas, and suppose it doesn't deal with every problem on Earth, but it deals with a lot of smaller problems that collectively end up being quite important. I mean, there's maybe you're not impressed with some of the projects that people would want to collaborate on, but maybe we would be. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's the talk about.
I'm not opposing. I'm not opposing, right? I'm just saying I would shoot higher.
Well, go be my guest. Okay, Nicholas.
Thank you, Jamie and Luis and Claire. Sorry for not putting on the camera. It's the last day, so I'm not in that a good condition to show myself up. I think it's a very good idea and proposal, and I fully support it. I would like to talk with you and with some delegates at the WTO to be part of the potential members that can discuss this with the DG and among members. I think it's an idea that should be of interest of the DG and the staff of the Secretariat, because it's not just an idea on public goods, but also an idea that can transform a bit the WTO itself. Like, it's not just rights for private transactions, but something different. So I think it's wonderful. Maybe I think a crucial concern or a crucial aspect for potential negotiations should be on the part of the asks, not just on the offers for public goods, but on the asks, because there's a possibility of offers becoming just, I don't know, capacity building projects, etc., something that can or that has happened in other aspects of the trips of the WTO negotiations. And part of we need that should be an important ingredient from the beginning on. That I fully support the general idea, and as much as possible, you can count on me and others on this.
Thank you. That's really great for people. Nicholas is a lead negotiator at the WTO for the government of Colombia. Well, I think it's a holiday season. It's past 11 right now. It's been. We can wind the call up right now. I think this is an introduction we wanted to make, and people can reach out if they want to. We actually have had discussions with the Director General of the WTO and her staff on this issue, but and you know, and we look forward to having more discussions. But thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Luis for taking the time to present and to co-sponsor this event for us. And we look forward. We really like working with Luis because he's one of the more effective people we work with in international negotiations, and it's just an honor to work with him. Thanks everyone else for participating. Josh, thank you for being one of the people to comment on the proposal. See you later, everyone.